Hello and welcome to today's ABP webinar event, Solutions to Non-Tariff Barriers in Africa, presented by Dennis Matanda. My name is Jessica Mackey with Africa Business Portal, and here at Africa Business Portal, we are committed to bringing together key players that we believe can work to reduce the barriers to doing business in Africa. These key players include expert advisors, companies of all sizes, nonprofits, organizations, associations, and government agencies. Built on a platform of FCPA compliance and anti-modern slavery, we are working to build up U.S.-Africa trade and investment the right way. Through Africa-focused webinars, such as this, forums, blog articles, and access to expert advisors and trustworthy companies, Africa Business Portal is becoming a valuable asset to the U.S.-Africa business community. To learn more, please check out www.africabusinessportal.com and see what you can do to become part of the solution. We are so excited to welcome with us today Dennis Matanda. Dennis has spent much of his career navigating the challenging waters of government and diplomatic relations. Not only has he received multiple graduate degrees in these fields, he has been able to work with many prestigious companies in both the U.S. and Africa. Currently, he is working as the head of government relations with Manchester Trade, based out of D.C. Somehow, he also manages to juggle being a trade and investment policy consultant with the African Union Commission, serving as an official representative of COMESA, working as an African expert at Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars, and still spending time with his twin daughters and his wife Rachel. And yet, amid all of this, he managed to make time to come and share with us his passion for using Africa resources and opportunities to overcome barriers to U.S.-Africa trade. I'm going to go ahead and turn the time over to you, Dennis.
Jessica, thank you for such a lovely presentation and introduction. And of course to the Africa Business Portal for this introduction and this opportunity. Of course I have time. And what I'm going to spend a bit of time doing is living up to the hype that you've given me and this particular event. My name is Dennis Matanda, and I'm thrilled, absolutely thrilled, to be talking about some of the most important and also some of the most difficult issues that every economy on earth faces. The United States has to face things like non-tariff barriers. Countries as poor as Burundi have to deal with non-tariff barriers and various stumbling blocks. And yes, it's very easy for us to talk about these issues, but these issues especially conspire with almost deadly precision in Africa. They affect growth, they affect peace, they affect development, they affect security, they affect investment, they affect trade in Africa. Yes, there is a direct relationship between non-tariff barriers and investment in Africa. There is a correlation between non-tariff barriers and intra-African trade. There is a non-tariff barrier reason at the heart of why Africa only contributes about 2% to global trade. I will say there's an unfortunate conspiracy between non-tariff barriers and the social, economic growth and development of the 54 members of the African Union. And suffice to say, non-tariff barriers are some of the most difficult issues to solve in Africa. They are almost, and anybody who knows anything about non-tariff barriers will tell you that if you can solve non-tariff barriers, you've solved all the issues I brought up, development, trade, whatever. Unfortunately, away from this presentation, some of Africa's best and brightest are already looking into these issues. I'm pleased to say that some of my clients from the African Union Commission in Addis Ababa are on this call, that my colleagues from the Commercial Secretariat in Lusaka have stayed at work or stayed away from other things to listen. Of course, they want to make sure that I don't embarrass them. But of course, then you have my colleagues from Manchester Trade who are here with me. At the end of the day, one of Africa's biggest issues is addressing non-tariff barriers, like I've said. Travel around Africa and you'll see what I'm talking about. But the best illustration I'll give you is that if there are 54 African countries and you even have 10 non-tariff barriers, for example, those get expounded into 540 non-tariff barriers. So when we talk about obstacles to doing business in Africa, this is what we talk about, the 540 barriers. And of course, there are more than that, many, many more than that. We will come and talk about them in a bit. But when we talk about barriers to doing business in Africa, some of us who work in this field actually tend to forget that there is an overall, what's the word? There's an overall, people forget that investors have options. Why shouldn't a business person take their investment to Croatia or Poland? Why shouldn't they go and invest in Brockton, in Boston, which used to export shoes in the 1950s and 60s? The infrastructure is there. Why shouldn't American investors go to Utah? Why shouldn't they go to Wyoming, which has very low unemployment? Why shouldn't they do any of these things? Why should they go to Africa? So it's easy for us as Africa specialists to think, yes, Africa is great. Yes, Africa is great. And the reason we talk about Africa being great is that many times people don't realize that Africa has all these natural dynamics with potential investors, such as American investors, European investors, South American investors. Most economies are market-driven. Most African economies will give you incentives as an investor. And most African economies will welcome you with arms open because they need the investment. They need all these things. However, this presentation outline is going to focus, is just going to break down obstacles to doing business in Africa. I'm going to talk about the non-tariff barriers to doing business with Africa. I'm going to talk about the solutions to the non-tariff barriers. I'll talk about the available resources, and hopefully some of the people or some of my colleagues will, during the Q&A session, send me comments. So if I hesitate a little bit, I'm sure one of my colleagues has either sent me a text message or sent me a comment. So I started the process of addressing some of the obstacles to doing business. Global competition. People have options. People don't really have to go to Africa. And if you look at some of the reasons that people don't go to Africa, is there's so many misconceptions. I was in Jordan a few weeks ago, and I was sitting down with a group of people who are specialists in pharmaceuticals, and they were asking me, but how do we get information on Africa? We don't even know if Africa has regulatory authorities. And of course, like my boss, Stephen Landy, and I talk about, I'm really good with internet research, online research, Google, Bing, and all that. And I can find pretty much anything. But you almost need to have a firm basis. You almost need to know where to look. So I can almost understand why people cannot have access to the information. They will have misconceptions about Africa, and they cannot do anything about it because they do not know where to start. Besides, with all due respect, with 200 and over 300, 400 channels for your television in the United States and all these opportunities available, like I mentioned, the global competition, the options, why would you actually think about Africa? But like I've also said, there's a natural dynamic in all these things. Let me now just come very quickly away from the misconceptions, including needing to bribe somebody, to almost providing an understanding of Africa's middle class. When it comes to Africa's middle class, I know very many people are talking about the opportunities around the Africa's middle class. There are so many people that are excited about Africa's middle class. So the further comments that I'd like to make is that although there is not a clear definition of the middle class in Africa, and there's nothing, and that people seem to agree that by 2010, Africa's middle class had risen from about 27% in 1980 to about 35% in 2010, like I said earlier. This is still a very small number, and people haven't really understood the middle class. People think that the middle class is going to do magic for them, but I think that it's important for us to help people understand what the middle class is. Africa's middle class can be divided into three different things. There's a group of the Africa's middle class who are called the vulnerable middle, who spend about $2 to $4 a day. Yes, it's easy for people to think, what? $2 and $4 a day is middle class in Africa? Yes, that is a lot of money. If you translated this into maybe Kenya shillings, that could be quite a bit of money. If you translated this into Ethiopian birr, that is quite a bit of money. And unfortunately, this vulnerable middle of the middle class has the potential to slip back into poverty very easily. Then there's the lower middle that has between $4 to $10 to spend each day. Now, again, $4 to $10 seems like a very small amount of money in the United States or in the UK or in any of these advanced economies. But in Africa, that is a lot of money. If I was to say $10 in Ugandan currency, it's probably 33 or 35,000 shillings. And if you have 35,000 shillings to spend in Uganda, that could translate ultimately into so many jobs in a consumer economy like Uganda. And of course, the last one is the upper middle, who have a whole host of, who have a lot of money to spend. These, of course, spend between $10 to $20 a day. That is the middle class. But to understand the middle class, you need to almost note the following things. One, the spending patterns in Africa are being dictated and shaped through the media and other influences as Africa opens up. The Africans actually would rather buy a mobile phone from a Nokia. They will not buy, I know that Ethiopia assembles mobile phones, but if you sometimes gave an option to an older person, they'll think, yeah, I'll take the cheaper one. But if you talk to the young people, they're very focused on quality. They want a brand, an international brand. And if you go to Ethiopia right now, you'll find that Chinese brands like Huawei are advertising in a very, very intense way to almost appeal to this aspirational audience. If you come to the second point, Africa has a disproportionately young population. 62% as of 2015 of the African population is under the age of 25. And then while only a third of Africa's population lives in cities like Addis Ababa, in Abidjan, in Nairobi, in Dodoma, and Johannesburg in South Africa, that segment accounts for 80% of each of those respective countries' GDPs. And in the next 30 years, half of Africa's population will live in cities. They'll not live in the big cities like Johannesburg, but Umtata in South Africa is a city. I could say that in Kenya, you don't have to live in Nairobi to make sure that's the capital city, but Nakuru is growing very fast. In Uganda, you will find places like Mbarara and Mbale and Gulu. I could go on and just break down all these things, but most of the Africans in the next 30 years will live in the cities. So away from Africa's middle class, infrastructure. I could go on and on and on about infrastructure. And yes, so many problems have been solved. The East African Standard Gauge Railway is coming online very soon. If you go to Ethiopia, again, there's a beautiful railway going on in the city. If you go into Nigeria, things are working very well. Abidjan, Ivory Coast has developed their port, and they've invested a lot of money, over $1 billion, to get their port working. So the infrastructure problems are being resolved. I want to go back to East Africa. If you go to Uganda now has electricity at least 50 or 50, 60% of the time. But those things are major issues. You might say that it's no longer taking you 18 days to get your container from Mombasa into the heart of East Africa. However, that is still so many days. You may have brought it down to less than 5, but it's still so many days. Now, if we moved away from that, there are improvements to Africa's doing business scale. African countries are doing so much better. But what about the roads, the potholes in the roads, the lack of skilled labor? These are issues, the lack of capital, the lack of financing. There are still obstacles to regulatory authorities, and these are issues. Interestingly, I have just spent a bit of time talking about non-tariff barriers, because each of the things I talked about, the electricity, yes, there's not a tariff to them right now, to the investor, but those are non-tariff barriers. But those are non-traditional non-tariff barriers. Traditionally speaking, non-tariff barriers, like you see on the screen, are basically restrictions from prohibitions. They are conditions. They are specific market requirements that make importation or exportation or doing business just basically difficult. These include unjustified or improper application of sanitary and phytosanitary measures and other technical barriers to trade. Now, these are the reason I talk about the non-tariff barriers is because I'm going to just go on for the rest of the presentation to talk about things from regional integration, the regional integration perspective, the African Union, COMESA, and of course, the non-tariff barriers arise from the different measures taken by the governments and authorities in the form of laws, regulations, the conditions, the restrictions they put in place, and sometimes it's private sector. If you're not aware of this, but there was a bit of an issue between countries in East Africa whereby sugar from one country couldn't go to the next country, although one country had a sugar surplus. It took the country's leaders to sit down and just say, you know what, we need this sugar to go through to the next level. That is a major solution around a non-tariff barrier, because that was a private sector thing. The private sector companies were preventing people from doing business. But on the other hand, if we talk about issues like economic partnership agreements, the private sector is also pushing for African countries to sign economic partnership agreements because they have a fundamental interest. These countries, or the country's private sectors, let's say flowers in West Africa that are being exported to Europe, if you do not allow the flower companies to keep exporting to Europe, that is preventing the private sector from making its money. Now, those could also mean non-tariff barriers if a country or an investor is trying to bring an industry into a particular country and wanting to do business with all the other countries. They will be prevented because the private sector in the different African countries could be very strong. And of course, it always says prohibitions that protect domestic industries from foreign competition, like I just mentioned. So what is the detrimental effect of non-tariff barriers on Africa? Well, we have to be very candid about this, that the biggest effect of non-tariff barriers and how these affect Africa, it basically ensures that intra-African trade is very, very minuscule. And if you want to see the direct correlation between how much Africa is able to do business and how much Africa contributes to the rest of the world's global trade, it actually comes down to non-tariff barriers. I would like to talk about the essence of non-tariff barriers because there's a history to non-tariff barriers. There's a very good book that I would like to recommend. It's called Why Nations Fail. It's by Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson. This book does not necessarily provide all the answers, but it almost provides inkling into why nations fail and why non-tariff barriers affect Africa so badly. There is a history to it because it actually argues that Africa's extractive institutions, for example, if you look at Africa's middle class, so to speak, there is a chance that they are very associated with a political party, and the political party might be pushing their particular tribes, their particular groups of people to make or to drive or to run the economy. These things have had a detrimental effect in countries like Liberia and countries like Sierra Leone, which have gone through really bad war periods. Countries like Somalia, a country like you could say a country like Rwanda went through this in 1994, and they have actually made progress. A country like Uganda, things have made progress, but there's still all these non-tariff barriers that come in to actually, there are all these historical elements that come in to affect the non-tariff barriers. And so you have organizations that have to struggle really, really hard to deal with the issues. If you want to look at an organization like the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, COMESA was built to provide solutions to non-tariff barriers. But they cannot do this, and they cannot provide the solutions as much as they can without the political support that is necessary to provide solutions to non-tariff barriers. If you do not have political will, if the leaders of the different countries, there are 18 countries in COMESA, if you don't have political will, you cannot necessarily move to the next level. Yes, it's very easy for us to sit here and say, well, they should be able to see that, well, non-tariff barriers are preventing Africa from getting to the next level. But this is and the African countries are in a very different situation, a different scenario from 1950 in the United States when Eisenhower insisted that there have to be interstate highways to make sure that commerce works in the United States. The World War had just gotten over, World War II had just gotten over, and there were opportunities to do extreme business with the rest of the world. Africa was different. African countries, there are 54 countries. Like I mentioned earlier, there are 540 barriers. People are so busy dealing with their history. People are so busy dealing with their internal issues. So how and what time do you have to deal with the external issues like non-tariff barriers, like export, import, investment, which is why organizations like COMESA, like the Southern African Development Community, like the East African Community are really, really important right now. And I bring this up to talk about the three regional economic communities, COMESA, SADC, and East African communities. It's because there is great potential. Last year, about 15 African countries acceded to something called the Tripartite Arrangement. The Tripartite Arrangement is not necessarily a free trade agreement yet, but if this comes into play, 26 African countries will break down their non-tariff barriers. That is the ideal. Of course, it will take long, and right now negotiations are going on, and as you can understand, it is really, really difficult to deal with these political issues. For example, how do you insist that the Democratic Republic of Congo and Zambia have to make sure that their one-stop border post has to be fully functional, and yet people on the Congolese side are actually not really as well paid as they ought to be paid. And then you have on the Zambia side, people trying to get their exports from South Africa into Zimbabwe, into Zambia, and then they come to the border and they cannot go through. Those are major stumbling blocks, and sometimes they need political solutions. I know I cannot mention all these specific details, But the reality is that if politics does not come first before the non-tariff barriers, my colleagues at COMESA cannot do their job. Mr. Ngwenya of the Secretary General of COMESA cannot do his job. The Secretary General of the East African Community cannot do his job if Kenya and Tanzania do not talk as often as they possibly can. These affect business, and the business is affected because of the history, and the history is affected because there are extractive industries like I talked about, or extractive institutions like I talked about. At the end of the day, it helps a great deal to solve the issues at a political level. The detrimental effect of non-tariff barriers on Africa is so big. It is almost the heart of solutions that organizations like the Tripartite Arrangement can provide. At the end of the day, if you do not have a political solution, and I'm so glad that my colleagues from COMESA are doing something about the political elements. And if you see, if you look at Mr. Ngwenya's passport, he is always on a flight going to a different country, trying to talk to the political leaders, going through the protocol issues, and trying to get people to see that if you solve the non-tariff barriers, you can solve all these issues, you will have a solution to Africa's major problems. I want to quickly move on to, I've talked about the non-tariff barrier effect on intra-African trade, but let me just expound on some of these issues. If an American business, let's say Procter & Gamble, wants to go into Africa, it will have to go to Nigeria and do business with Nigeria. It will have to go into Ghana and do business with Ghana. But Ghana and Nigeria are members of ECOWAS. And in January 2015, they signed the customs union. Now, ideally speaking, it is much easier for people to do business between Nigeria, Ghana, Ivory Coast. It is much easier. And if you go to the East African Community, it's easier now to do business between Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania, Burundi. And if you see what this has done to Eastern Congo, because Eastern Congo and the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, that shares a border with Uganda, business is doing so much better because products are getting to the Congo much, much faster. But if Uganda does not solve its road network issue, these products will not get through. If Uganda doesn't solve its highway between Kampala, the capital city, and Gulu, which is in northern Uganda, products cannot get to southern Sudan, which means investors who would like to provide, let's say, human hair for women to put into their braids and weaves and things like that, they cannot get these products on time. And if it takes them 36 days to leave Mombasa to get to southern Sudan or to get to Juba, at the end of the day, that increases the cost of the hair or the products, as it were. And this has an effect if it is a non-tariff barrier. It's not necessarily that the taxes are extremely high, but if it takes long for the product to leave the port, if it takes long for somebody to actually have to get products from point A to point B, if they're paying bribes, this money has to come from somewhere. They will ultimately put the price onto the end user, and the end user is going to have to spend that little money. I talked about the middle class. If they're spending between $2 and $4 a day, and the products are just increasingly becoming more expensive, then they have less to spend on their family. And if you understand the vicious circle of poverty, it ultimately just leads to less and less and less, which means the non-tariff barriers are directly affecting the middle class. If we want to increase the number of middle class people, we have an obligation to solve non-tariff barriers. I want to talk about the non-tariff barriers and importing and exporting in Africa. But I want to juxtapose this with what the United States has done with and for Africa. Right now, between 39 and 41 African countries, sub-Saharan African countries, are taking advantage of a wonderful preference program called AGOA. The African Growth and Opportunities Act is open. It is telling the Africans, we are open for business. It's telling the Africans, bring in at least 97.5% of what you provide, or what you grow, what you have, and bring it to the United States. We will receive it. Of course, you as an African have to spend a bit of time bringing your stuff. You have to do your research. You have to find your market. You have to find your potential partners. You ultimately have to get your product from Africa to the United States. But if somebody has to grow their stuff, if somebody has to grow their tomatoes in Sokoto, in northeastern Nigeria, and they cannot get their tomatoes to the ports in Lagos, and it takes them much longer, and they don't have refrigerated trucks, that is a major issue, which means you have all these great products that are sitting there in Africa. And although the United States has said we have an open market, they cannot necessarily get these products from Sokoto to the United States. Now, I'm not saying American investors need to go to Africa and fix the roads. No, they should not do this. I think I mentioned earlier that most of these economies are open economies. They are driven by markets. And these non-tariff barriers that I talk about, these extractive industries, this private sector, it ultimately means that there are very few people benefiting from the status quo. What investors do for a country, or what they could do for non-tariff barriers, if you ultimately look at it from that perspective, what that does is that it says, if there are very many investors investing in Sokoto's tomatoes, in Nigeria's tomato industry, and they're keen to export this stuff from Sokoto to the United States, the Nigerian government could think of this as a way to diversify from their oil into agriculture, which means they will actually see the need to invest in proper roads and proper infrastructure. And this is what a market is supposed to do. The market drives demand. AGOA is an open door policy, but AGOA could be a way to get American investors to go to Africa, invest in particular things, and ultimately prepare a way for many of these non-tariff barriers to be dispensed with, so to speak. The American investors could work very closely with entities like COMESA, with entities like the African Union, to actually solve many of these issues. I want to just quickly move on to the next slide, and then talking about how the non-tariff barriers affect U.S.-Africa business. This is it. This is the key. The non-tariff barriers are preventing the United States investors, big investors, people who would like to put $50 million into a particular country. It doesn't make sense for people to put $50 million into a country. It makes sense if they put $50 million into a region. If you want to put a business in a country like Rwanda, Rwanda should be able to catapult you into its neighbors, into Tanzania, into Burundi, into Uganda, into Eastern Congo. This should be the solution. And those solutions are countries like Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, the Democratic Republic of Congo are members of COMESA. COMESA has a way of playing a role, and COMESA has a way of playing a role for the U.S.-Africa business. You would rather deal with the COMESA countries. So fortunately, countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo and Ethiopia, which are members of COMESA, finally acceded to the COMESA Free Trade Agreement, which means if we find more solutions around the non-tariff barriers, if Ethiopia opens up its borders more to business from Kenya, if Ethiopia opens up its borders to business with Djibouti, so to speak, which it's already doing right now. That is going to be the fantastic relationship. And if you want to see a great solution to non-tariff barriers, Ethiopia and Djibouti are working very well together because Ethiopia needs access to the sea. Djibouti provides them with that access. The relationship between Djibouti and Ethiopia is symbiotic. And if you want to look at it from an ideal perspective, if you could have a road between Congo-Brazzaville, which is in the western part of Africa, and Mombasa, that is right almost in the middle of Africa, that could be a major breakdown of a non-tariff barrier. But how do you get the road to work if Congo-Brazzaville doesn't even talk to Congo-Kinshasa, which is right next to it? That is an issue. Politics again. These are the things affecting U.S.-Africa business, because you would not necessarily have to go all the way around from the Cape of Good Hope to get to Mombasa. You would just bring your goods into Congo-Brazzaville, and they would go by road all across Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, to Kenya, to Mombasa. That would be a major solution, because along the way, just like happened in the United States, the highways bring development, they bring peace, they bring security to all these entities. I have a few more minutes to go. I've got 10 minutes. Redefining non-tariff barriers. Non-tariff barriers need to be redefined, and they need to bring in not just the traditional ones whereby we talk about regulations, prohibitions, and all that. We need to redefine non-tariff barriers to say, if we do not solve all these issues, including perceptions, and I want to just go back to some of the issues I talked about earlier. If we don't actually solve these perceptions, audiences, if we don't solve issues based on, I need to get this slide to work. If we do not necessarily get those perception issues working, if we do not get the competition issues working, those will keep playing to the non-tariff barrier audiences. We need to find solutions, but we need to redefine these first. Non-tariff barriers can no longer just be the traditional ones. Non-tariff barriers need to be some of the non-traditional ones that we talked about earlier. And this is what will bring solutions. I say and I talk about solutions because the African Union is a supranational body. The African Union has 54 African countries, and they are working towards a continental free trade agreement. The Continental Free Trade Agreement is going to be the next best thing since sliced bread. People can say whatever they want, but this is great. If 54 African countries can come together and negotiate and actually accede to a Continental Free Trade Agreement, you have to tip your hat to the African Union, because this is a very difficult task. This is an ideal situation. The African Union has something called Agenda 2063 that basically says 100 years after the Organization of African Unity, or AU, was formed in 1963, what kind of Africa do we want? The Africans should be doing business together. Is there a chance for the United States of Africa? Because if there's a United States of Africa, forget what's happening in the European Union right now. If you have a United States of Africa, you have major solutions to human security, food security, technology security, and all sorts of things. Regional economic communities, there are 8 building block wrecks of Africa. I mean, I was having a conversation with one of the regional economic communities a few days ago, and they basically said, do you know how great it would be to actually have the Tripartite Arrangement signing a strategic relationship with ECOWAS, for example. So the 15 countries in ECOWAS having a relationship with the 26 countries of the Tripartite Arrangement. That would be beautiful. And then somebody mentioned and said, oh, but we already have a relationship, because the Africa Trade Insurance, which is an export credit agency providing political risk insurance in the East African region, is doing business in West Africa. We are actually doing it. So there is progress from that perspective. I'm just going to quickly talk about the tripartite arrangement because this is the heart, and this could be the heart and soul of the next level of business. The fact that these three regional economic communities, the East African community, SADC, and COMESA, came together. Of course, many of them have interrelated, or countries that have, like a country like Tanzania is a member of the East African community, is not a member of COMESA, but is a member of SADC. I mean, they have cross relationships. The Democratic Republic of Congo, Madagascar, Mauritius, Zambia, Zimbabwe are both members of COMESA and SADC. From that perspective, if you can have this beautiful amalgamation of nations, can you imagine if they now went in and had a relationship with ECOWAS? That would be a great linkage. And so if there can be a relationship between the East African Chamber of Commerce and the Nigeria Chamber of Commerce, why can't there be a relationship between ECOWAS and the Tripartite Arrangement? This is something that would make great progress. The Continental Free Trade Agreement is actually a roadmap, and it could be the way to go. All these things here, solving these non-tariff barriers, getting these formal institutions in place, are all preparing the process of solving the non-tariff barriers. Yes, they are going to form a customs union ultimately, hopefully by 2019. They are also working on free trade, which means there's going to be customs between all these countries. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter how successful the Continental Free Trade Agreement is. If we do not resolve the non-tariff barriers, we will not have as much success as it is. What are the ideal circumstances of doing business in Africa? Within the next 4 minutes, I can say, ideally, to do business with Africa between the United States and Africa, and I want to focus on sub-Saharan Africa, the ideal circumstances are that United States investors will look at Africa as a place to go and manufacture, to do their business, so they can export this stuff back to the United States under the African Growth and Opportunities Act, AGOA's free, duty-free, quota-free aspect. This is opportunity. If you would like to do business with the United States, I met a wonderful woman in Ethiopia who is building her own brand of shoes. This stuff here could be in the United States. There is a market. In the world's largest consumer market, or country as a consumer market, there is a market for Ethiopian goods. There is a market for Ugandan fruit. There is a market for Kenyan cloth. There is a market for all this stuff. There is a market for Nigeria's tomatoes. At the end of the day, there is also a market for oil and non-oil products. There is opportunities in this country. I am going to say that ideally, if Americans can go and invest in Africa, deal with the regional economic communities, they can deal with the respective countries, they will also be contributing to the non-tariff barriers because, like I said at the beginning, these non-tariff barriers are political. But we need to support the regional economic communities. We need to support the African Union. But we don't need to support them by going there. We need to invest because the market will determine all these things. Adam Smith was right. The market is king. So I thank you so much, and I would like to open this up for questions, if there are any. So I have a question, and it says, what do I consider, just give me a second, what do I consider the top 5 non-tariff barriers? This is actually a very loaded question. So let me respond in a very technical way. There are 8 categories of non-tariff barriers that have been identified as non-restrictive. There's government participation in trade and restrictive practices tolerated by government. Of course, there's the lengthy customs and administrative entry procedures. And then, of course, there are elements like the technical barriers to trade, like if the border post does not work or if there's no electricity, that's a technical barrier. And of course, there's what they call the sanitary and phytosanitary measures. For example, these SPS measures mean that a country like Ethiopia is going to say, we do not want any animals from any other country. So if a country like Kenya would like to export very delicious Kenyan meat to Ethiopia, Ethiopia could say, no, we will put SPS or sanitary and phytosanitary measures. Entities like COMESA are working on this. Entities like the African Union are hoping that these will be solutions ultimately when we come down to solving the CFTA's non-tariff barriers, so to speak. But others include quantitative restrictions. They could basically say, oh, there's going to be a quota on this. We will not allow more sugar into our country. There'll be charges on imports. There'll be issues around transport, clearing, forwarding, issues related to transit clearance, and other procedural issues. It's notable that no non-tariff barriers have been reported, and people are solving this. If you look at the Tripartite Arrangement, it has a website that is dedicated specifically to solving non-tariff barriers. And what they say, that out of the maybe 487 that were reported over the past 1 year, at least 300 have been solved. So from that perspective, there are solutions. I want to just go to the next question, which is, why should I take my business to Africa? Under the circumstances. Why should I take my business to Africa when there are fewer obstacles in places like Bermuda and Turkey? If you have been to Turkey and if you have been to Bermuda, well, and then if you have been to any African country, I can assure you that the welcome you receive in Africa is going to be much, much more open than you think. And frankly, it doesn't mean that just because Bermuda has fewer resources than a country like Rwanda, so to speak, does not mean that it doesn't mean that there's anything special. People always wonder, well, do I have to go to the president of Rwanda? Do I have to go to the president of Uganda or Nigeria to actually get my business through? I actually met some of these wonderful investment authorities at a meeting in Egypt, and you will find that if you just go to these technocrats, if you just go to these people, they have a fundamental interest in providing you with support. After all, they have been charged with promoting investments, and so they will be very open to doing business with you. I say this to say that you should take your business to Africa because the guys in Bermuda or Turkey or Azerbaijan, Croatia, or any of those countries will not give you what the Africans can give you. The ultimate thing I'd like to talk about is that Africa is addressing some of the investors' biggest worries, which are, for example, political risk insurance. Political risk is probably a bigger issue than many Africans would think. The Americans are always wondering, well, that's a risky investment. What can I do to mitigate my risk? Well, the African Trade Insurance, it's called ATIA, for example, is an export credit agency that will provide you with a solution around credit and political risk. The government will basically provide you with support. It helps as well that the United States thus far has signed bilateral investment treaties with at least 6 African countries. The last was signed with Rwanda. But if you go to the Democratic Republic of Congo as an investor and anything happens to your investment, the Congolese or the Democratic Republic of Congo needs and would have to pay you back. There is a bilateral investment treaty with Senegal And this would actually provide you with solutions. And the other question that I have, I have questions on, I have a question on, is language a non-tariff barrier? Frankly, yes. If we're going to redefine it, yes. But there is a solution to that as well. If language is a non-tariff barrier, what you can do is there are solutions within the countries themselves. If you go to a country like Ivory Coast or Cote d'Ivoire, they speak French. If you go to a country like Mozambique, they speak Portuguese. But there will be English speakers available. This is actually something that is a market-driven solution. There is a market for, if you as an American investor wants to do business in Africa, there are people who will provide you with a solution. The market has provided solutions. The last question that I have right now is, if I'm interested in doing business in Ethiopia, how do I overcome the ownership issues? Frankly, I do not know how to solve these issues. However, I think Ethiopia is a classic case of the market actually finding solutions of its own. Less than 2 years ago, you had to have your products shipped, pre-inspected before they were shipped to Ethiopia. Now, companies like Intertech, SGS, and Cotecna can do the pre-shipment for you because Ethiopia now has something called a compulsory Ethiopian standards, a list of about 124 major products that are exported from the different countries. You could do the pre-inspection, pre-shipment inspection through entities like this. I know this is not enough, but that, in my opinion, is progress. The market is making progress because the diaspora investors, the various investors, the people with Ethiopian nationality are pushing the country to change. This is progress, and I think that this is going to happen ultimately. So my appeal to American investors is invest in the region. It will generate rewards in the long run. I don't have any more questions. I don't have anything else to say for the moment. I just wanted to, let me just summarize my overall presentation as we come towards the end of the 11 o'clock hour. There are so many opportunities in Africa right now. There is a business case could be made to move business to Africa. But just like the non-tariff barriers are based on politics and getting the politicians to almost see that there is potential, there is an absolute need to update things like AGOA. The African Growth and Opportunities Act was enhanced in 2015. The African Union, working with the regional economic communities, came together and they proposed a few changes. The AGOA was extended for 10 years to assure certainty for the investors, which means you can invest for a 10-year period and you will not have the program yanked from under you. But AGOA needs to be enhanced. In other words, how do you increase Africa's overall, how do you increase Africa's participation in global trade from the 2%? How do you increase it from the 2% to another thing, to a larger number? Well, one of the biggest solutions would be to update things like AGOA's rules of origin and accumulation, for example. If you did this, what that means is that countries like, let's say, a country like the United States can send its exporters, for example, to allow African countries like Kenya, for example, to participate in global supply chains and distribution networks. I say this to say that if you said that products that have African inputs, let's say African inputs up to 35%, let's say a mobile phone, an iPhone. If an iPhone could be assembled in Uganda, or part of an iPhone, at least 35% of an iPhone is assembled in Uganda, you could say that AGOA's rules of origin could be updated to say if a product has 35% from an AGOA beneficiary, it can come into our country duty-free, quota-free, which means the product can come from wherever it is finally packaged. If it's finally packaged in Finland, if it is finally packaged in Azerbaijan, but it has 35% content from Africa, it can be exported into the United States, duty-free, quota-free. This could be a significant development, and African countries could be inserted into global supply chains and distribution networks, which means if there's an opportunity to do all this business, African countries, the president, the ministers, have a fundamental interest in bringing all this investment to their country, which means that's a political decision, which means that would be a way to say, you know what, we have all these non-tariff barriers, language, traditional or non-traditional non-tariff barriers. We can provide all these solutions. And if you're going to bring these global supply chains and distribution networks to Africa, that will be a solution to employment. That will be a solution to health. That will be a solution to growth, to development. If you want to see all this progress, just bring more investment to Africa. The market will take over and people will provide solutions ultimately. What will entities like COMESA and the African Union do? They will finally have an opportunity to do their job. Thank you so much. I want to just turn this over to Jessica. Jessica, thank you so much.
Dennis, thank you so much for joining us for today's ABP webinar event. If you have any additional questions that you haven't already asked that you would like Dennis to answer, just go ahead and submit them now using the Q&A window on the left of your screen, and we will be sure to include them as well as any unanswered questions in the written version of the Q&A that we'll be sending out. We would love to take this chance to invite you guys to join Africa Business Portal to continue enjoying quality webinars about Africa business, such as this one. Our upcoming webinar schedule boasts everything from the VP of International Affairs at Freeport-McMoRan to Africa ambassadors to the United States. Africa Business Portal will continue to bring you quality solutions to U.S.-Africa trade and business, but today's webinar will actually be the final complimentary webinar offered to non-members. So go ahead and sign up today to become a member of ABP and a part of the solution to building up U.S.-Africa trade and investment. Thank you all for being a part of today's webinar, and we hope that you'll join us again. Thank you.